May 1945. The silence that falls over Europe is deafening. For 6 years, the continent has echoed with the thunder of artillery, the scream of dive bombers, and the grinding treads of armored columns. Now, the guns have finally cooled. The Third Reich has collapsed into a dystopian landscape of rubble and ash, and the red banner flies triumphantly over the Reichstag in Berlin. But as the smoke clears from the greatest conflict in human history, a new, silent crisis is forming, one not of soldiers, but of machines. Across the vast, bruising expanse of the Soviet Union, stretching from the shattered streets of Berlin to the icy, fog-bound ports of Murmansk, from the dusty, sun-baked airfields of Poland to the sprawling supply depots deep in the Caucasus Mountains, a metallic ocean sits waiting. It is an inventory of staggering, almost incomprehensible proportions. Parked bumper to bumper in muddy maintenance yards are Studebaker trucks by the tens of thousands, their windshields reflecting the gray sky. Resting on remote airstrips, their propellers still and their engines cooling, are rows of Douglas A-20 Havocs and Bell P-39 Airacobras, looking like dormant predators. These machines are the physical embodiment of the Lend-Lease program, the industrial lifeline that the United States extended to the Soviet Union when the Wehrmacht was knocking on the gates of Moscow in 1941. For 4 years, this river of steel flowed eastward, sustaining the Red Army's fighting power through the darkest days of the war. But now, they face an uncertain future. The war in Europe has ended, the common enemy, fascism, is defeated, and suddenly, the question of what happens to 427,000 wheeled vehicles and 18,297 aircraft delivered by the United States is no longer a logistical footnote. It is a diplomatic emergency. Soviet authorities are faced with a massive dilemma. Do they return this equipment, purchase it, or quietly absorb it into their battered state? These are machines worth billions of dollars, technically owned by a nation that is rapidly transforming from a wartime ally into an ideological rival. Meanwhile, in Washington, American officials are demanding answers about the largest transfer of military equipment in recorded history. They want an accounting, they want payment, or they want their trucks back. The disposal of Lend-Lease material is about to become the first silent battle of the Cold War. While the physical fate of these trucks and aircraft tells a story of pragmatic necessity, mechanical cannibalization, and gradual disappearance, the sheer scale of American assistance remains difficult to comprehend even today. Let us look at the numbers, for they are the architecture of this crisis. Under Lend-Lease, the United States shipped a total of 49,526 trucks to Soviet forces. This was not a random assortment of vehicles. It was a targeted injection of mobility that mechanized the Red Army. The list included 152,000 Studebaker US-6 2.5-ton cargo trucks, a vehicle that became legendary among Soviet drivers for its reliability and its ability to digest the low-grade fuel often found on the Eastern Front. It included 184,000 General Motors and Dodge light trucks, and over 50,000 Willys and Ford Jeeps, the ubiquitous runabouts of the war. On the aviation front, the transfer was equally massive. Deliveries totaled 14,795 aircraft through direct transfer, with thousands more arriving via other Allied channels. The Bell P-39 Airacobra alone accounted for 4,746 units. This particular aircraft, often rejected by Western pilots for its lack of a turbocharger, found a loving home in the Soviet Union, where air combat took place at lower altitudes. Its 37mm nose cannon was perfect for busting German tanks and bombers. The Douglas A-20 Boston Light Bomber contributed nearly 3,000 airframes. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, and North American B-25 Mitchells filled out the ranks of the Red Air Force. By May 1945, these machines were not sitting in warehouses. They were woven into the very fabric of the Soviet military machine. They were scattered across hundreds of military installations. The Studebaker truck had become the primary prime mover for Soviet artillery units. If you saw a Soviet Katyusha rocket launcher, the terrified Stalin's organ, firing on Berlin, it was almost certainly mounted on the chassis of an American Studebaker. Entire Soviet air regiments were equipped solely with American fighters. The legendary ace Alexander Pokryshkin scored the majority of his 59 kills in a P-39 Airacobra. But we must be realistic about what these machines looked like in May 1945. These were not showroom-fresh vehicles. They were war-weary veterans. They were operational, yes, but they had survived years of brutal use on the Eastern Front, the harshest theater of the war. They had been driven through the thick, clinging mud of the Ukrainian Rasputitsa, the freezing snows of the Russian winter, and the choking dust of the summer offensives. Soviet maintenance crews had performed miracles to keep them running. They had adapted to American engineering, which was often more complex and precise than domestic Soviet designs. They developed improvised repair procedures, sourcing spare parts through a chaotic mix of official shipments and battlefield scavenging. A Soviet mechanic might use wire and scrap metal to fix a carburetor on a Dodge truck, because the official replacement part was thousands of miles away. Most of the aircraft showed heavy operational wear. Engines were tired, their cylinder compression low. Airframes were stressed from high G maneuvers. Aluminum skins were patched and repatched. Many required major overhauls that the Soviet industry was ill-equipped to provide. The truck fleet exhibited a similar pattern of exhaustion. Some vehicles were approaching complete mechanical collapse, their suspensions shot and engines knocking, while others remained surprisingly serviceable. This enormous fleet represented not just military hardware, but a terrifying logistical dependency. Soviet planners viewed this reliance with increasing unease. As the war concluded, they realized that a significant portion of their logistical backbone, the trucks that carried bread to the cities and ammo to the garrisons, belongs to a foreign power, a power that might soon demand it back. The realization was stark. The Soviet Union had won the war, but its ability to function in peace was tied to the goodwill of the United States. And that goodwill was running out. In Washington, the mood was shifting rapidly. The warmth of the wartime alliance was cooling. The camaraderie of the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, was evaporating with Roosevelt's death and the dawning realization of Stalin's post-war ambitions in Eastern Europe. President Harry Truman, new to the office and deeply suspicious of Soviet intentions, took a harder line. American officials approached the Lend-Lease settlement not with sentimentality, but with the cold, hard expectations of a contract. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 was clear, or so the Americans thought. It stipulated a specific condition: equipment destroyed, lost, or consumed in the direct fighting of the common enemy required no payment. A tank blown up at Kursk? Written off. A plane shot down over Stalingrad? No charge. That was the price of victory. But surviving military equipment fell into a different category. Weapons systems, tanks, artillery, combat aircraft, could be retained without charge only if the United States deemed them obsolete or impractical to return. However, non-military goods and equipment that had civilian utility in peacetime required a different resolution. This was the crux of the issue. Civilian utility meant trucks. It meant transport planes like the C-47. It meant industrial machinery, locomotives, telephone wire, and boots. These items had value beyond the battlefield. They were essential for rebuilding a shattered nation. The United States demanded that these items be either returned to American custody or purchased by the Soviet government on long-term credit. The State Department and the War Department began a massive accounting project. They created surveys to assess exactly what remained in Soviet hands. Their estimates were formidable. Officials calculated that between 250,000 and 300,000 American trucks had survived the war in Soviet service. Along with them were perhaps 10,000 to 12,000 aircraft in various conditions. Washington's expectation was straightforward. Moscow should purchase the civilian useful equipment at depreciated values or ship it back. The Foreign Economic Administration prepared detailed inventories and established settlement procedures beginning in August 1945, just weeks after the Japanese surrender brought the war to a total close. American negotiators proposed a figure. The Soviet Union should pay approximately $2.6 billion for the retained Lend-Lease goods. To the Americans, this was a bargain, pennies on the dollar for vast fleets of vehicles that would jumpstart the Soviet Reconstruction. They even established warehouses in American-occupied Germany and Austria, ready to receive the returned equipment. Teams of logistics officers, armed with clipboards and checklists, prepared to inspect, catalog, and process the returning material throughout late 1945 and 1946. They expected convoys of trucks to come rolling across the demarcation lines. But this commercial approach collided violently with the Soviet perspective. To understand the Soviet reaction, one must step into the shoes of a nation that had been bled white. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people. Its industrial heartland was a ruin. Thousands of villages had been burned to the ground. Soviet authorities regarded Lend-Lease equipment through a fundamentally different lens, a moral and ideological one. Stalin and his planners did not see the aid as a loan. They saw it as compensation. In their view, the Soviet Union had borne the disproportionate sacrifice of defeating Nazi Germany. While Britain and America built up their forces and bombed from the air, the Red Army had engaged the bulk of the Wehrmacht on the ground for years. Moscow viewed the trucks and aircraft as partial payment for this burden. When the Americans asked for $2.6 billion, the Soviets were insulted. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle. Soviet negotiators argued that the vast majority of the equipment had been destroyed or worn beyond economical repair during combat. They presented official responses claiming that only 52,000 trucks remained serviceable by the war's end. American analysts dismissed this figure immediately. It was a statistical impossibility. It understated the survival rate by a factor of 5. Intelligence reports clearly showed massive parks of Studebaker trucks in Soviet cities. Regarding aircraft, the Soviet representatives were even more dismissive. They insisted that combat losses, operational accidents, and normal attrition had reduced the American-built air fleet to negligible numbers. President Truman's administration, however, saw the settlement as more than just accounting. They viewed it as leverage. They hoped to link the financial resolution of the Lend-Lease debt to broader political concessions on European issues: Poland, the Balkans, the occupation of Germany. They wanted to use the debt to force Stalin to cooperate. This proved to be a massive miscalculation. The commercial approach didn't force cooperation, it hardened resistance. Stalin was not a man to be bought or bullied. The settlement discussions became a mirror of the emerging Cold War, suspicious, accusatory, and fundamentally disconnected. The Americans were talking about contracts and depreciation schedules. The Soviets were talking about blood spilled and cities burned. The language of capitalism was clashing with the language of survival. And while the diplomats argued in paneled rooms in Washington and Moscow, the equipment on the ground began to move. The window for a peaceful, organized return of the equipment was closing fast, slammed shut by the icy winds of political mistrust. While the diplomats traded memos and accusations, the Soviet state was taking decisive action. In reality, Soviet officials had begun systematically redeploying Lend-Lease equipment immediately after Germany's surrender. They knew the Americans might ask for the trucks back, and they had no intention of losing such a vital resource. The strategy was simple: disperse and absorb. The Studebaker trucks, the backbone of the Red Army's logistics, began to vanish from military roles. They were moved from frontline rifle divisions and artillery units directly into civilian reconstruction projects. The priority was the devastated western regions, Ukraine, Belarus, and western Russia, where the scorched earth policy had left virtually no infrastructure intact. Imagine a Studebaker US-6 that had carried 122mm shells to the Zelo Heights. Overnight, it was repainted. The olive drab was covered with a coat of rough civilian paint, or sometimes just allowed to fade. The white American star on the door was sanded off, replaced by the red star, or the simple identification number of a collective farm. It was no longer a weapon of war, it was a tool of peace. Thousands of vehicles were transferred to the NKVD. These were not just border guard units, but internal security forces, construction battalions, and civil defense organizations. By moving the trucks to the NKVD and the MVD, Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Soviet government effectively removed them from the military inventories that were subject to the most scrutiny. The NKVD operated like a state within a state, and its inventories were a black hole to American inspectors. The truck fleet followed a unique trajectory because wheeled vehicles possessed obvious civilian utility. A T-34 tank is useless for rebuilding a city. It destroys roads rather than building them. But a 2.5-ton cargo truck with six-wheel drive? That is worth its weight in gold in a country with few paved roads. Soviet planners recognized that the Studebaker US-6, the Dodge WC series, and the Willys Jeep could substantially aid the reconstruction efforts. Scrapping them or returning them would have been an act of economic suicide. The Soviet automotive industry, focused entirely on tank production for 4 years, was struggling to switch back to trucks. The legendary Soviet truck, the Gaz-AA, was a simple, rugged machine, but it lacked the power, the payload, and the all-wheel drive capability of the American Studebaker. So the American trucks were diverted. Construction trusts received thousands of them for hauling bricks and rubble in ruined cities like Minsk, Stalingrad, and Kiev. Agricultural collectives, the kolkhozes, obtained Studebakers for hauling harvests. The truck that had carried ammunition to the gates of Berlin was now carrying wheat to the silos of Ukraine. Forestry operations in Siberia and the Far East acquired the rugged American trucks for logging operations. The 6x6 drive of the Studebaker was perfect for the muddy, roadless taiga. Soviet mechanics appreciated these trucks deeply. They were comfortable. Many had heated cabins, a luxury unknown in Soviet trucks. They were powerful, and they were tough. This reallocation was systematic and massive. By 1948, American-built trucks were operating throughout the Soviet civilian economy. British diplomats in Moscow reported observing this phenomenon with a mix of amusement and frustration. In 1946 and 1947, they saw American-built trucks driving through Soviet cities, hauling goods, transporting workers. One British attaché noted seeing a fleet of Studebakers, poorly painted but running well, delivering coal in Moscow. These observations supported the American claims that Soviet accounts were dramatically understating the surviving equipment. But possession is 9/10 of the law, and the trucks were deep inside Soviet territory, far beyond the reach of any repossession team. The struggle for parts. However, keeping them running was a challenge that grew harder every day. The United States had supplied enormous quantities of spare parts during the war: tires, batteries, spark plugs, engine components. But with the end of Lend-Lease, the supply chain was severed. Stocks depleted rapidly. Soviet industry attempted to bridge the gap. Factories were ordered to produce replacement parts for American trucks. The results were mixed. Some components, like brake pads or simple mechanical linkages, could be manufactured adequately. Others, complex electrical parts, specialized gaskets, and high-tolerance engine components, proved beyond the immediate capabilities of a Soviet industry that was struggling to rebuild itself. This led to the next phase of the fleet's life: cannibalization. As vehicles broke down, they were not repaired. They became organ donors. A truck with a blown transmission would be stripped to keep 3 other trucks running. A Willys Jeep with a cracked engine block would have its axles, lights, and seats stripped to save its brethren. By the early 1950s, the surviving truck population had begun to decline substantially through this attrition. Many vehicles sat abandoned in yards and depots, skeletons picked clean of useful parts. The harsh Soviet climate, the bitter winters that cracked rubber, and the mud that rusted steel accelerated the deterioration of these neglected machines. Yet, for a crucial 5-year period, these American trucks literally carried the Soviet economy on their backs. While the trucks found a second life in the wheat fields and forests, the aircraft faced a much darker, swifter fate. The calculation for aviation was fundamentally different. A fighter plane has no civilian utility. You cannot use a P-39 Airacobra to plow a field. You cannot use a P-47 Thunderbolt to transport timber. They are machines of pure destruction, expensive to run and impossible to repurpose. Furthermore, the technology of flight was advancing at breakneck speed. The jet age was dawning. The piston-engine fighters of World War II were becoming obsolete overnight. The Soviet Union was already testing its first jets, the MiG-9 and the Yak-15. Why keep thousands of American propeller planes that required high-octane American fuel and American spare parts? Soviet Air Force commands received orders to retire American types from operational service. The transition was brutal and rapid. Combat types were withdrawn from frontline fighter and bomber regiments. By late 1945, most Bell P-39s and Douglas A-20s had been relegated to training roles or ferried to remote airfields in Central Asia and Siberia for storage. But storage, in the Soviet context, often meant abandonment. Imagine the scene at an airfield in Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan. Hundreds of American aircraft, once the pride of the fleet, towed to the far edges of the tarmac, to remote, grassy sections. There were no hangars for them. Hangars were for the new Soviet jets. There were no protective tarps. They sat under the open sky, exposed to the continental extremes of the climate. In the summer, the sun baked the paint and cracked the plexiglass canopies. In the winter, snow piled up on the wings, weighing them down. The deterioration was swift. Metal corroded. Fabric control surfaces rotted away under the rain. Tires perished and flattened, leaving the planes resting on their rims, looking like wounded birds. The aluminum airframes of the Bell P-39s proved particularly vulnerable. Corrosion attacked the riveted joints and structural members. The planes began to dissolve. But before nature could finish the job, man stepped in. The Soviet economy was desperate for raw materials, particularly non-ferrous metals like aluminum. The Soviet Union had vast bauxite deposits, but processing aluminum takes massive amounts of electricity, which was in short supply. These thousands of aircraft represented a massive, pre-refined mine of high-grade metal. Systematic disposal began accelerating through 1946 and 1947 as Soviet-American relations plummeted. Scrapping operations were organized at dozens of airfields. It was a brutal industrial process. Aircraft were dragged to chopping areas. Heavy machinery and cutting torches were used to slice the fuselages into manageable sections. The engines, massive, complex pieces of engineering, were ripped out. Instruments, radios, and propellers were stripped, sometimes saved for spare parts for the few remaining active planes, often just thrown into separate piles. The airframes were melted down. The aluminum was reclaimed and fed back into Soviet industrial production. It is a strange irony that the metal from an American P-39 might have been melted down and recast into the skin of a Soviet MiG-15, a jet that would, just a few years later, be shooting at Americans over MiG Alley in Korea. Thousands of aircraft disappeared this way between 1947 and 1950. It was a massive erasure of history. A field that held 500 planes in 1946 would be empty by 1949, leaving only oil stains and shattered glass in the grass. There were a few exceptions to this slaughter. The Douglas C-47 transport, known as the Dakota in the West, was so useful that the Soviets had actually produced a license-built copy, the LE-2, since 1939. Real Lend-Lease C-47s continued flying with Aeroflot and military transport units well into the 1950s. They were workhorses, indistinguishable to the untrained eye from their Soviet-built cousins. They flew to the Arctic. They flew mail to Vladivostok. They carried party officials. Similarly, some P-63 King Cobras, an advanced, larger version of the P-39, were retained for specialized training roles. The Soviets liked the tricycle landing gear of the Cobra series, which was easier for new pilots to master than the tail draggers common in Soviet designs. But these were the lucky few. The vast majority of the fleet ended as ingots of scrap metal. The British experience mirrored this, though on a smaller scale. Britain had transferred over 5,000 aircraft to the Soviet Union, mainly Hurricane fighters. The British Air Ministry quietly wrote off most of these as combat losses. They knew recovery was impractical. British diplomats understood that demanding the return of a few thousand obsolete Hurricanes was not worth the diplomatic capital it would cost. They watched as the American negotiations stalled, using that as a barometer for their own resignation. By 1948, the great American air fleet in Russia was gone. It had been consumed by the very nation it helped save. The diplomatic battle over the bill dragged on for decades, long after the machines themselves had rusted away or been melted down. It became a zombie negotiation, alive but going nowhere. In 1948, American negotiators, realizing the futility of their initial demands and acknowledging the depreciation, reduced the requested payment to approximately $1.3 billion. But the Soviets continued to dispute everything. They disputed the valuation methodologies. They disputed the survival rates. They disputed the very idea that they owed anything. Stalin's government made token payments, insultingly small sums totaling about $48 million by 1951. It was a fraction of what was owed, a diplomatic slap in the face. The Cold War had transformed the Lend-Lease settlement from a commercial transaction into a symbolic confrontation. Neither side could compromise. For the Americans, it was about the sanctity of contracts, the rule of law, and the betrayal of an ally. For the Soviets, it was about national pride. They refused to pay for the tools they had used to save the world from fascism. To pay would be to admit that American industry, not just Soviet blood, had won the war. The Soviet position hardened further after Stalin's death. Nikita Khrushchev's government asserted that Soviet wartime sacrifices exceeded any possible financial compensation. Formal settlement discussions essentially ceased by 1960. The file gathered dust in the State Department. It wasn't until the détente era of 1972, under Nixon and Brezhnev, that negotiations resumed. Finally, an agreement was reached where the Soviet Union acknowledged $722 million in obligations, payable over decades. Even then, payments were sporadic until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The vanishing physical evidence. By the time the debt was acknowledged, the physical evidence was almost gone. Of the 400,000 trucks delivered, perhaps 100,000 survived into the early 1950s. By 1960, American-built trucks in Soviet service had become uncommon. Rare sightings in the remote Far East or Central Asian republics, where replacement vehicles arrived slowly. Studebaker trucks proved to be more resilient survivors. Dozens emerged from barns, forests, and industrial yards across the former Soviet republics. Farmers had kept them running for decades, hiding them away, patching them up. Private collectors and museums sought them eagerly. Today, restored Studebaker US-6 trucks appear in Victory Day parades in Russia, their engines humming once again, finally recognized not as foreign contraband, but as vehicles of victory. Conclusion. The story that began in May 1945, with hundreds of thousands of machines facing an uncertain future, concluded with a slow, systematic disappearance. Most were neither returned nor paid for. They were absorbed, used up, and discarded. What survives today, perhaps 24 aircraft and several hundred trucks, represents less than 0.1% of what was delivered. They are precious fragments of a massive material exchange that helped determine the outcome of the Second World War. They stand as silent witnesses to a time when two superpowers united to defeat a common evil, before the Iron Curtain fell and turned allies into enemies. The rust on their frames tells the story of a bridge built between worlds, a bridge that burned down as soon as the war was won. If you found this exploration of post-war material disposal interesting, consider subscribing for more detailed looks at forgotten historical episodes. Next up, we will explore what happened to German Tiger tanks after World War II, how the feared predators of the battlefield were captured, tested, and scattered across the globe.